Dark Souls 3 is the finale of the series, but does it go out with a bang or with a whimper? Well, as someone who's finished the game twice, once on a normal run, another time on New Game Plus with no HUD, and dressed up as Soler with his weapons and armor, my impression is that it's a bit of both. And that's kind of disappointing because it's not quite the amazing finale we would have liked for it to be, but it's also not a bad game in any way, shape, or form. It's actually a pretty damn good game, arguably the best I've played this year. But it does have its problems. Let's talk about the good though. The level design is amazing, arguably the best levels in the game. They look back on themselves, there's a lot of secrets, a lot of attention to detail, they look great, they feel great, there's a superb atmosphere, and they're a joy to navigate. On top of that, it's the best PC version of any Souls game we've ever gotten, with the best mouse and keyboard controls in the series. No input lag, no mouse problems. You can play this game with mouse and keyboard without having to use anything like a mod or an auto hotkey script, and you will do just perfectly fine. That's what I did on New Game Plus. And I've made my case why mouse and keyboard is actually better than a controller. Some objective advantages there compared to a controller. So yeah, it's good on those particular levels. Superb level design, a joy to navigate through the game, but it does have its problems, and I want to talk about those issues. And I do want to be very clear that overall, I greatly enjoy this game. I just feel, in a sense, that it's lackluster in certain areas, or there are certain things that annoy the fuck out of me. For starters, the combat system, it's much faster. That's not the problem in itself, but the problem is that with that speed, they also changed the way poise worked, or disable. Like, people have checked the game files and they discovered that poise, regardless of the armor you're using, is actually disabled. There are some special abilities that you can use to give you poise, but by default, even if you're wearing something as Havel said, even the lowliest enemies can stagger you, which is ridiculous, quite frankly. It's kind of a problem. And they've increased the speed on enemies by quite a bit, from regular enemies to bosses. And the problem with that is the damage on a lot of these abilities isn't that high, but they're attacking very, very quickly. And you can just easily be stun locked and be killed by very basic enemies, which is, quite frankly, a big annoyance. Though, keep in mind, I play with Soler's armor and shield. I'm not exactly going with an optimal build here, just for the record, on the subject. But it is something to keep in mind, however, that's a particular annoyance of mine. Another thing, however, a bigger issue, is although the levels are great, I just feel they're too short, and there's too few of them. I've checked, there's fewer locations in Dark Souls 3 than there are in Dark Souls 2. And although I greatly enjoy Dark Souls 3 and I do feel Dark Souls 2 has problems, I kind of feel disappointed by the fact that theirs are shorter. And they're shorter even in comparison to Dark Souls 1. There's nothing as massive, there's nothing like, say, Blighttown or Anne Orlando. Anne Orlando in Dark Souls 1, that was a massive area and you had to navigate for a lot. And even though you go to Anne Orlando in Dark Souls 3, it just doesn't compare. Even when you take Aerophil of the Boreal Valley and Anne Orlando in itself, and you put those two together, they just fall flat on their faces compared to Anne Orlando in Dark Souls 1 in terms of scale of level, in terms of length of level, and grand scale of the overall level. So that's one problem that I have with the game. Another issue that I have with the game, well, bugs, glitches, internet problems. So the game is focused a lot on multiplayer this time around versus previous Souls games. Like, it's arguably the most multiplayer focused game in the series. You can easily summon people, you can easily get summoned by people, there's a lot of covenants. Switching covenants is done by just changing a covenant slot, a dedicated covenant slot. Very easy to do that, very easy to get invaded, to invade people, very easy to get free phantoms, to get a massive amount of phantoms. And the problem with that, well, that's twofold. There's two major issues with that. First and foremost is the fact that the netcode is shit, to put it blunt. Like, there's so many times I've found myself in a situation where I couldn't be summoned or I couldn't summon other people. Like I've played the entire Souls series mainly on my own. I'm not the kind of person who regularly summons phantoms. I summon them for an occasional boss here and there, but overall I like to play on my own or summon NPC phantoms, not player phantoms. But this time around, because it's so focused on multiplayer, you would think that they do well on the netcode side of things, the server side of things. The problem is they don't. A famous bug is getting T-shaped phantoms or being seen as T-shaped yourself. So for instance, you summon someone or you get invaded and that person is T-shaped. You can't see their animations. That's a big major issue, isn't it, for PvP, because you do need to see what they're going to do, how they're going to attack in order to be able to survive that. If you can't, it turns into a bloody mess. And that's one of the bigger issues with multiplayer. Another issue though with their focus on multiplayer is that a lot of the bosses, I'd argue perhaps even the majority of bosses in this game, are designed in such a way that they're considerably easier if you summon help. If you summon a player phantom, not even NPC phantoms, but the player phantom, if you summon a player phantom, you'll have such an easier time with the boss. In particular, bosses like the Nameless King, Aldrich, Prince Lothric, and even Gwyn himself, they will be considerably easier by a quantum leap. They'll be considerably easier than if you just did them on your own or if you did them with NPC phantoms. And although you could make the argument that in the entire series this has been the case, it's not quite the same. I've defeated bosses with player phantoms in previous Souls games, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2. It doesn't compare. It's a massive difference, and it just feels like a lot of these bosses are designed in such a way as to be fought by 2, 3, 4 people even, 4 people at the same time. That's just how my impression of the game is. Take for instance the Nameless King. Take for instance that particular boss. A boss that has very fast, high damage attacks. So if you bring someone else, and the way the boss is, how close the boss is to the bonfire indicates to me that you're supposed to actually, they knew they were going to make a difficult boss fight, so they put it right next to the bonfire. And if you die in the boss fight, you actually get your souls before you enter the boss area, like they'll be put outside the boss area. So that indicates to me they clearly knew this was going to be a challenging fight, but at the same time, you bring phantoms there, and you'll have a much easier time with that particular boss. Same with Prince Lothric, just an example there. Prince Lothric, it's a 2 boss fight, and those generally support, bring a phantom in that kind of a boss fight obviously gives you an advantage, but with Prince Lothric, because he keeps reviving his fellow prince, that makes it considerably easier because you have to kill Lothric. You don't have to kill the guy he keeps reviving. Thing is, trying to kill Lothric while on your own when you're dealing with the other prince who will attack you with a sword is a bit difficult. Bring a phantom, however, get the boss distracted, you'll have a much easier time. Then there's Aldrich, another perfect example. Aldrich is arguably one of the better designed bosses in the games, with the exception of the Rain of Arrows, which is in phase 2 of the fight, quite frankly, ridiculous. It will follow you for a very long period of time. It will do massive amounts of damage. So the only thing you can do is run around the area, but bring another player, and the arrows will follow one player, and the other can go continuously hit the boss, and the boss probably, hopefully, won't target the player that's being chased by the Rain of Arrows with his other abilities, because that's the problem with the Rain of Arrows. It's not the arrows themselves necessarily, because you cannot run those. It's the fact that the boss is still there and he's doing ranged attacks. So quantum leap in terms of difficulty when you're on your own versus when you're with phantoms, and that's bad. That's horrifically bad for a Souls game. In Dark Souls 1, I finished the entire game when it originally came out and I got my hands on it. I did that whole thing on my own with no players. No player phantoms, because I was playing offline, because the game at the time was actually not available in my country. So playing it online was out of the question. I did play it online. I did summon phantoms eventually on repeated runs for some bosses, but first run alone. Dark Souls 2, vast majority on my own. Dark Souls 3, Also on my own, but there's clearly bosses where, or on my own or with NPCs that you could summon. Also on my own for the most part though, no player phantoms for the most part, with the exception of a couple of bosses where summoning players really makes a huge difference, and you'll just have a much easier time. Take the Dancer of the Frigid Valley for instance. It's not as bad as say Nameless King or Soul of Cinder or Aldrich in terms of phantoms, but bring a phantom there, you'll also have a far easier time than if you're on your own. Of course, the mitigating factor for that particular fight is that you can hide behind pillars in order to retreat and recover. And that's the thing with the bosses. They're fast. There's a lot of bosses that will attack very, very quickly, like the Dancer of the Frigid Valley or the Soul of Cinder. With the exception of the Nameless King, however, a lot of their attacks may not necessarily do a lot of damage per hit, but there's a lot of them. So take for instance Soul of Cinder. He'll do this massive sweeping flaming attack that will stun lock you, and you can't do anything to escape that if you get stuck in it. The damage isn't that high. In fact, the damage is what you'd get in a single hit in a previous Souls game, but you're stuck there for 10 seconds not being able to do anything and having no control over your character, just hoping to eventually dodge, roll away, and survive the hit after the explosion following that attack. And that's crap, by the way. That's not really the way you should do a boss, in my personal opinion. So that's one massive issue. The multiplayer-focused aspect of the game, coupled with the fact that, well, there's bugs with multiplayer, there's issues with the netcode, there are issues with summoning, and there's issues in the way the bosses are designed, and takes away quite a bit from the bosses themselves. A lot of the bosses in this game, just on their own, are crap. They're mediocre at best. There's a couple of them that are interesting, but overall pretty mediocre. The game is great, the areas are great, but, well, if you don't count the Profaned Capital, you call that an area, Miyazaki, coupled with one of the easiest bosses in the game, yeah. Yam is a disappointment. The Deacons of the Deep are an utter failure of a boss, and I could go on, but you get the point. There's a good number of bosses in this game that are a joke, and then there's a spike in difficulty in some bosses. Bosses, not areas, but bosses. There's a huge spike in difficulty when you're going something against like Dancer of the Frigid Valley, or Soul of Cinder, or Aldrich, or Nameless King, etc, etc. Just a couple of bosses here and there, but other stuff is not so difficult. So spikes in difficulty, bad design, bad balance, quite a few issues there. Major issues, I might add, on that subject. But there's another aspect, one final aspect that takes this game down. The, not story, I've never really believed Dark Souls has a story, but more like lore, the world. And the world, the lore, the character of the world, that's one of the things that draws people. And the world has character, it feels alive, it feels, even though it's a dead world or a dying world, it feels alive. It feels like this has been a place where people have lived, and this is, you know, what's happened. This is the history, this is the lore. And there's always been a connecting thread, an overall connecting thread to these worlds. In Dark Souls 1, that was clearly Gwyn. You know, all the lords, a lot of the bosses, and your main objective was, all of it was all tied to Gwyn, and his actions were linking the flame. And Orlando, Sans Fortress, Sif, the Scaleless Sif, Artorias, I could go on. You get the point. A lot of it was connected to Gwyn, including Solaire, supposedly his son, right? A lot of it connected to Gwyn. In Dark Souls 2, it was all connected to Vendrick. You know, Aldia, his wife Nishandra, the Throne of Want, Dranklake Castle, the Kingdom, Shrine of Mana, Velstad, you get the point. A lot of it connected to King Vendrick. And they improved on that with the DLC, where you could actually talk with him and get his input on various things once you got the various crowns there. And then Scholar of the First Sin came around and added even more of a connection with that, on that subject, with Aldia, the Scholar of the First Sin, his brother. So quite a good connection, tying everything together there. And Dark Souls 3 doesn't have that. Dark Souls 3, on that particular level, is a mess. It doesn't have a connecting thread outside of perhaps the fire, but even then the fire doesn't quite link everything, every boss, every area in the game. It doesn't connect that. The only connection the fire has is with the various lords of Cinder, and obviously the fact that the land is in the state that it is because of the diminishing fire in the world. But it just doesn't compare to Vendrick and Gwyn, and you even have Gwyn, or his remains, the remains of his soul in this game that you're fighting as the end boss, and it just doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like you felt through Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2 with Gwyn and Vendrick respectively. And another point, Dark Souls 1's most famous character, the most beloved character, is Solaire. In Dark Souls 2, their role is filled by Lucatiel. Now I do believe Solaire is a better character overall than Lucatiel is, but these were characters that you got attached to. These were characters you cared about. These were characters that left an impression on you as a player, a big one on you as a player, as you traveled through this dead world in both cases, or dying world, and you're on your own, you're facing harrowing challenges, and here were these two on their own journey, as you are, trying to make the best of their respective situations. One of them is doomed, another one could be doomed, or you could save them, depending on what you did there. And obviously there's an attachment there that is created between the player and these characters, because you're going through the same journey, and you would encounter them at various boss fights. And in particular, Solaire showed up at quite a few boss fights, including the toughest fight in the game if you summoned him, Ornstein and Smaug, and he could show up if you saved him at the final boss fight. Whereas with Lucatiel, she also showed up at a number of boss fights, and they realized that she was important, so they actually put her in the final boss of the final DLC of the game, so you could summon her right there. So that was quite important for the player to have a connection with the character like that. And yet in Dark Souls 3, we don't have that. The closest that we get is Anri of Astora, but Anri just isn't on the same journey that we are. She or he, they're on their own journey to kill Eldritch, and that's it. And they may die, they may be killed one way or another, turn hollow, go insane, be assassinated to unlock one of the endings, or they may succeed in killing Eldritch and then go hollow anyway. So that could happen right there, but it's just not the same path that, not the same kind of journey that Lucatiel or Solaire were on. Lucatiel and Solaire were characters that you met throughout various areas in the game and weren't just on a set path through one area. Whereas Anri is going to the Cathedral of the Deep, then she goes in the Catacombs, and then finally to Anne Orlando. She's not going through the entire area of the game to try and complete, that. Whereas with Solaire, most importantly, it felt as if he was on the exact same journey that you were as the player. Slightly less so with Lucatiel, but still kind of the same thing with her as well. Just doesn't have the same impact. Finishing Dark Souls 3, it felt shorter, it felt less epic, it felt less grand, it was frustrating, it had a good number of shitty bosses, and it didn't feel like a proper ending to the series. Is it a good game? Yes, without a shadow of a doubt. Take whatever you want from this video, but it's still a good game. It's still a game worth a buy, but it is not the best in the series. It's not the one that leaves the biggest impression on you as a player in the series. And one may talk about nostalgia, but even Dark Souls 2 left a bigger impression on me than Dark Souls 3 left. I will not replay Dark Souls 3, with the exception of obviously the DLC when that comes out, and maybe they do a better job with that than they did with the base game. It felt rushed. It felt mediocre in places. It felt like a lot of the bosses were crap, for the lack of a better word, and it didn't have the same connecting thread that the previous games did, the Vendrick, Gwyn respectively, or characters like Solaire or Lucatiel. And that's what I think about Dark Souls 3. Costin here on Serious Gaming, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.